Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is never loud. It doesn't shout through headlines. It doesn't echo through rumors. And it rarely arrives wrapped in the comfort of simplicity. It lives quietly, hidden between the lines of perception and reality, and more often than not, it is less glamorous, less sensational, and far more human than the stories people build around it. When we talk about what happens behind the public face of a human being, especially someone who lives under relentless scrutiny, we're not just talking about facts. We're talking about emotions, patterns of thought, psychological resilience, the architecture of the human brain, and the fragile complexities that shape the way a person navigates life. There's a misconception many carry: the idea that brilliance and power must be accompanied by some sort of cold detachment from ordinary human experience. But neuroscience tells us something far more intricate. Our brains do not separate personal life from ambition, love from logic, fear from innovation. Everything is interconnected, like an intricate neural web where every impulse, every emotion, every decision creates a ripple that touches something else. And when you live at the intersection of constant pressure, global influence, and extraordinary expectations, those ripples turn into tidal waves. People often ask, what does a private life look like when the world never stops looking at you? It doesn't look like a perfectly lit photograph or a curated story. It looks like late nights when your thoughts grow louder than any crowd. It looks like a heart that still breaks, a mind that still questions, and moments of silence that can feel louder than applause. Neuroscientists have long studied the concept of cognitive load, the amount of information, emotion, and responsibility a single brain can process at once. Under extreme conditions, this load becomes something extraordinary. It can sharpen a person's clarity to near superhuman precision, or it can blur the boundaries between the personal and the public so completely that they start to disappear. Every human being builds some kind of psychological firewall, a way to protect what's real from what the world projects onto them. Some do it through isolation, some through overexposure, some through humor, some through silence. When life becomes a stage, privacy is no longer a location. It becomes an internal fortress, built not of walls, but of mental frameworks, neurological adaptations, and emotional strategies. And the most fascinating part is how these fortresses evolve. Take, for example, the well-documented phenomenon in high-performing individuals known as emotional compartmentalization. It's not a myth. It's a measurable cognitive strategy. When you face constant public analysis, your brain starts creating internal partitions, like cleanly divided rooms in a house, so that certain emotions don't interfere with certain decisions. Imagine needing to make world-changing technological choices while simultaneously feeling the sting of personal loss. The brain learns to silence one room while the other speaks. It's not coldness, it's survival. It's how a human mind learns to keep moving when the world won't let it stop. But here's the paradox. What makes someone appear unshakable on the outside often reveals a storm on the inside. Behind every public figure's carefully controlled image is the exact same limbic system that governs all human emotions. Love, fear, hope, anxiety, joy, and heartbreak. You can't engineer your way out of being human. Even the most analytical mind must still wrestle with the primal forces of attachment, loneliness, and longing. Neuroscience shows that no amount of external success can deactivate the brain's social circuitry. Humans are wired to connect, to be understood, to love, and to be loved. And when that connection is repeatedly strained by scrutiny and expectation, the private world becomes a place where the mind negotiates between reality and the roles it has been forced to play. Imagine waking up and realizing that every gesture, every glance, every moment of silence is interpreted by millions, sometimes correctly, often not. Your private reality begins to drift further from the world's perception of it. That gap, over time, doesn't just affect reputation. It affects the very way the brain processes trust. Studies on chronic exposure to public scrutiny show altered activation patterns in the prefrontal cortex, the very region responsible for executive functions, emotional regulation, and decision-making. People in this state often develop heightened vigilance, not because they crave control, but because they have to construct clarity in a world built on projections. But beneath that vigilance, something deeply human persists, the desire for belonging. No matter how vast the empire, how powerful the mind, or how relentless the mission, the brain still whispers the same quiet need. To be seen not as an idea, but as a person. To be loved not as a symbol, but as a soul. That's not weakness. That's biology. It's the same neural architecture that connects a parent to a child, a lover to a partner, a friend to another friend. Fame doesn't erase it, it only complicates it. In the private spaces that no camera sees, the conversations are often not about rockets, empires, or algorithms. They're about the fear of not being understood, about the trade-offs between purpose and presence, about the quiet grief of time lost to a mission bigger than oneself. These are the places where the public figure fades and the human being remains, raw, unaided, and fragile. Some might imagine that immense power and influence bring a sense of invincibility. But in truth, they bring something entirely different, a heightened awareness of how fragile everything truly is. Neuroscientific research into leadership under pressure reveals a fascinating pattern. The greater the external responsibility, the more private emotional intensity a person experiences. This is because the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, doesn't differentiate between a personal threat and a global one. Whether it's a looming failure in a global project or the pain of a broken relationship, the same neural fire lights up inside. And so, a private life under extreme public visibility becomes a kind of delicate balancing act. It's about learning when to listen to the world and when to silence it, when to protect your own humanity from the weight of expectation, when to allow the private self to breathe. This is not just philosophy, it's neuroscience at its most human level. A mind under siege adapts, but it never stops yearning. People often wonder why someone would choose to live such a life, one that seems to leave so little room for ordinary peace. The answer is never simple. Purpose has a gravitational pull. It consumes time, love, and energy. It gives meaning but demands sacrifice. And the sacrifice most invisible to the world is often the personal one. Relationships tested not by betrayal or boredom, but by the sheer velocity of existence. Moments of tenderness compressed between flights, boardrooms, laboratories, and a global chorus of expectations. But here's something remarkable. The human mind is capable of extraordinary emotional engineering. Some build small rituals to anchor themselves in reality. A walk at night, a quiet meal, a short, silent moment before a launch or a meeting. These rituals act as emotional reset buttons, grounding a person in their own humanity. Neuroimaging studies show that such grounding moments reduce activity in the brain's stress response circuits and reactivate the default mode network, the neural pathway associated with self-reflection, imagination, and personal meaning. In other words, in the middle of a storm, the mind searches for small doors that lead back to itself. And then, there are relationships, not the kind the tabloids invent, but the real ones. The ones built in quiet hours, away from the spotlight, where love is not measured by photographs but by presence. This kind of intimacy becomes a sanctuary. It's not always perfect. It's often strained by the gravity of ambition. But it becomes a place where the brain can finally put down its armor. Love, in its truest form, is not a distraction from greatness. It's a neurological refuge. It's the one force capable of softening a hyper, alert mind and reminding it of its own humanity. Some may see this and think, but surely, someone so powerful doesn't need love in the same way ordinary people do. That's where they're wrong. Studies on emotional attachment make it clear, even the most independent minds rely on safe emotional bonds to regulate stress and maintain psychological resilience. Love is not a weakness. It is one of the strongest neurological stabilizers we have. It allows the brain to enter restorative states. It gives meaning beyond mission. It's what allows a person to look up at the night sky and not just see stars and possibilities, but to feel, for a moment, at home in the universe. When the private world begins to shrink under the weight of global attention, some choose to close it off entirely. Others choose to let a select few inside, and sometimes one person, just one, becomes the bridge between the private and the public self. That bond, fragile and precious, can hold together a mind being pulled in 1,000 directions. It is through such bonds that even the most relentless individuals find their quiet moments. In the language of neuroscience, this is called co-regulation. When two nervous systems synchronize, creating emotional safety that the brain alone cannot fully produce. It's why even those who seem untouchable often find themselves returning to a single trusted presence. Not because they need protection from the world, but because they need to remember who they are when the world is watching too loudly. We often romanticize genius, innovation, and power as if they exist outside the realm of ordinary emotion. But the truth is, behind every extraordinary story is a very human heart that beats in the same rhythm as yours and mine. And in that private rhythm lies the real story, one the world rarely sees. The reality of a private life lived under public heat isn't glamorous. It's not candlelit dinners in perfect silence or cinematic strolls under starry skies. It's a tug of war between presence and purpose. It's whispering soft words to someone you love, while half of your brain still calculates trajectories, strategies, and consequences. It's being in a room filled with noise, yet feeling the weight of what isn't said. The pressure doesn't end when the lights go out. It often grows heavier in the quiet, because silence has a way of amplifying everything the world doesn't see. One of the most intriguing findings in neuroscience is how chronic public exposure alters the way the brain processes solitude. For most people, solitude is a place of rest. But for those who are relentlessly watched, solitude can become something else entirely. A fragile mirror. It reflects not only who they are, but also the distorted image the world believes them to be. The brain begins to oscillate between these reflections, trying to reconcile identity with image. Over time, this dissonance creates something researchers call self-concept strain. A subtle but powerful erosion of personal clarity. It's not a crisis of ego. It's a neurological adaptation to being perpetually observed. And yet, in the cracks of that strain, something unexpected happens. The human mind, resilient as ever, searches for meaning with more intensity. When the external world becomes too loud, it turns inward. The private life becomes a laboratory, not of machines or inventions, but of emotion, of humanity itself. Every conversation, every choice, every rare moment of stillness becomes amplified. The simplest gesture, someone holding your hand, a quiet laugh over a shared meal, an unspoken understanding in the middle of chaos, begins to matter more than any public triumph. Many assume that people in positions of extraordinary visibility build their lives around power. But more often than not, they build their private lives around moments where they can simply be unarmored. To laugh without calculating perception. To love without the world watching. To speak without being interpreted. These small spaces of raw existence become the most valuable real estate of the soul. And the older the story grows, the more fiercely these spaces are guarded. I often think about the neuroscience of attachment and how it defies every illusion of invincibility. Even in the most driven minds, attachment is not optional. It's deeply coded into the human nervous system. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, doesn't care about fame or power or intellect. When someone looks into the eyes of another person they trust, their brain releases it. The heart rate slows. The amygdala calms. The prefrontal cortex begins to re-engage with clarity. It's why some of the most brilliant people in history sought not grand palaces of solitude, but one person they could return to. A single voice that felt like home. But love in the shadows of ambition is a different kind of love. It's love that negotiates with absence, adapts to time zones, survives through static on late night calls, and lingers in words never spoken. It's not about grand gestures. It's about continuity. It's about two people who can hold the thread between them, even when the storm howls louder than the world applauds. That kind of love isn't built in the spotlight. It's built in the quiet trenches of trust. And then, there's vulnerability, something that the world doesn't easily associate with power. Yet it's the hidden architecture of resilience. Vulnerability is not the absence of strength. It's the willingness to remain human when the world demands perfection. Neuroscience tells us that suppressing emotion doesn't erase it. It simply reroutes it deeper, often manifesting as stress, insomnia, and even physical illness. That's why, in the private corners of their lives, those under immense pressure often break not in weakness but in relief. Relief that, for a brief moment, they can stop performing strength. This is the paradox of visibility. The world mistakes performance for essence. But essence lives behind closed doors. It lives in the moment someone lets their guard down in front of the only person who truly knows them. It lives in quiet tears that no one will ever see, in words whispered not to the crowd but to the night itself. Those moments don't make headlines, but they shape the mind more deeply than any public victory ever could. When neuroscientists study high stress cognition, they often speak of neural fatigue, the point at which relentless decision making begins to erode emotional equilibrium. It doesn't matter how brilliant the mind is, every human brain has a threshold. And when that threshold is reached, the private world becomes either a place of refuge or collapse. Some build emotional sanctuaries, some build walls, some lose themselves entirely. The difference often lies not in intellect, but in whether they have someone to return to, someone who sees them not as a headline, but as a heartbeat. This is why the private life of a public figure can't be fully understood through gossip or speculation. It's not a story of scandal or spectacle. It's a story of survival, of a mind trying to hold on to something real while navigating a world that insists on turning everything into narrative. It's about choosing, again and again, to remain tethered to what's human when everything pushes you toward becoming a symbol. Let's talk about something few ever truly consider: the cost of relentless purpose. When a brain is wired to chase monumental goals, it naturally deprioritizes smaller, softer rhythms of life. It doesn't mean it doesn't crave them. It simply places them in a hidden chamber, waiting for a pause that rarely comes. Over years, this creates a strange emotional backlog. Moments that should have been lived are instead archived, waiting for a time that may never arrive. Many carry that weight quietly. And it's not the weight of regret. It's the weight of deferred living. This is why, in rare quiet hours, people who seem larger than life often speak in whispers. Not because they have nothing to say, but because their private language is softer than their public voice. It's a language built not for applause, but for presence. A language spoken between two people who understand the difference between being known and being seen. And so, what does the truth about a private life like this really look like? It looks like contradictions coexisting. It looks like a man who can shape futures, but still fears losing the simplest, purest parts of himself. It looks like extraordinary ambition and fragile humanity intertwined in the same breath. It looks like someone who can move mountains in the daylight, but still needs to hold someone's hand in the dark. I've always found it fascinating how the brain, despite its brilliance, is still just as vulnerable to loneliness as it was thousands of years ago. Evolution hasn't built an immunity to it. No technology can override it. The neural circuits for connection remain stubbornly ancient, still responding to eye contact, to a shared breath, to a quiet heartbeat near yours. You can build rockets to the stars, but you will still crave someone who asks, not about the mission, but about your heart. That's the part no spotlight can illuminate. That's the real story behind the public stage. The private self is not an accessory to greatness. It is the foundation of it. Without that inner world, without those quiet bonds and fragile truths, the outer achievements would be hollow scaffolds. The public may see brilliance, but brilliance is sustained only when the private heart remains alive. And when that heart is threatened by noise, chaos, or loss, everything else begins to shake. Behind the armor of ambition lies the same neural vulnerability we all share. Behind the stage lights, the same quiet yearning. Behind the extraordinary, the most ordinary of needs to be loved, to be known, to be held not for what one builds, but for who one is. In the end, the private life of someone who seems untouchable isn't a mythic story. It's not made of secrets meant for headlines. It's made of neural fire, emotional bonds, silent battles, and the fragile beauty of being human under impossible light. And maybe that's the real truth, the one no rumor can ever quite capture, and what happens when the private life begins to fracture under that impossible light. Neuroscientists have a term for the quiet breaking point: emotional dissonance collapse. It's the moment when the internal world and external performance are no longer synchronized. The brain starts to send conflicting signals, like a machine running too hot for too long. The cost is never paid in dollars or data. It's paid in sleepless nights, in words left unsaid, in the quiet ache of someone who feels both everywhere and nowhere at once. But even here, there is resilience. The human mind is astonishing in its capacity to rebuild. Every neural pathway that bends under pressure can also rewire itself through experience, connection, and choice. This is what gives people the strength to keep walking through storms that would have broken lesser foundations. It's not about avoiding pain. It's about carrying it with grace, letting it sculpt deeper layers of clarity. Some imagine private life as an escape from purpose, as if ambition and intimacy live on opposite sides of a river. But in truth, they flow through the same terrain. Greatness without grounding becomes emptiness dressed in gold. And intimacy without purpose risks being adrift. What makes a human life whole? What truly sustains the mind is not the denial of either, but the intricate weaving of both into something unshakable. This is why some of the most extraordinary people in history have lived with a kind of quiet duality. They carry immense weight in public, but they fight their most meaningful battles in silence. They lead armies of ideas, but they anchor their hearts to just one or two people who truly see them. They are not gods. They are not myths. They are minds trying to stay intact in a world that keep trying to turn them into stories. Love, in such a life, is not an ornament. It's oxygen. It is not there to decorate the narrative. It's there to keep it human. And those rare few who are led into that private orbit aren't chosen for their beauty, or their charm, or their fame. They are chosen for something far more sacred: their ability to see through the noise, to listen without demanding performance, to offer silence that feels safer than applause. The world, from the outside, often believes it understands a person because it watches. But watching is not understanding. True understanding requires proximity of the soul, not just proximity of the lens. It's built in quiet hours no one will ever post, in words spoken softly in the middle of the night when masks fall away. It's built in that tiny space between vulnerability and trust, where one heartbeat learns to match another. The neuroscientific truth is simple, but profound. The same circuits that enable us to lead, create, and innovate are also the circuits that make us ache for closeness. They cannot be separated. And when they're forced apart, the entire internal architecture begins to strain. So when you look at someone who carries the weight of empires on their shoulders, understand this: their private life is not a luxurious afterthought. It is their anchor. It is what keeps the edges of their mind from unraveling. There is also a quiet, almost invisible grief that lives inside the private world of the endlessly watched. It's the grief of knowing that no matter how real your emotions are, the world will always reinterpret them through its own narratives. And so trust becomes something sacred, not easily given, fiercely protected, sometimes lost forever. But when it is found, when a connection is real, it becomes a sanctuary like no other. When the world believes it knows you, your real identity begins to live underground. It's not secrecy, it's survival. It's the mind's way of protecting something that cannot survive in the noise. The brain builds hidden rooms, emotional safe houses where only the truest bonds are allowed. Those bonds become the heartbeat of everything else. They are not visible, but they are real. And that's what makes the truth of a private life so profoundly human. It's not a collection of hidden scandals or untold plots. It's a quiet, ongoing negotiation between a person and the weight of existence. It's the fragile weaving together of ambition and love, of pressure and softness, of a world that demands performance and a soul that needs rest. Behind every innovation, every seemingly unstoppable force, there's a human being who closes their eyes at night like everyone else. Someone who has known both triumph and heartbreak. Someone who, at their most unguarded, doesn't dream of applause, but of peace. Someone who, despite the myths and projections, still carries the simplest of hopes to be held, to be trusted, to be known. And perhaps that's the most universal truth of all. No matter how extraordinary the mission, how vast the vision, or how loud the world becomes, the private self always returns to the same primal need. The need to belong. The need to be real somewhere. That's why the most important parts of a human life will never appear on screens, or in books, or in the echo of headlines. They live in the quiet corners, in the eyes of the few who truly matter. They live in the moments when the world fades away, and only the heartbeat remains. If you strip away the noise, the fame, the projections, what you find is not a legend. You find a person, a brain still bound by the same synapses as yours, a heart that beats the same rhythm, a soul searching for meaning not on the grand stages, but in the spaces that no one else can see. The truth about a private life, like this, isn't a revelation to be sensationalized. It's a mirror, a reminder that even those who seem carved from light are made of the same fragile, beautiful human fabric as the rest of us. The real story is not out there, scattered across headlines. It's in here, where ambition meets emotion, where innovation meets longing, where brilliance bows to the quiet gravity of love. And in the end, when the stage goes dark, when the world stops looking for a moment, when the applause fades into the night, it is not the noise that remains. It is the heartbeat. It is the whisper. It is the quiet truth. That is where the real life lives.